Hi, this is Cory Dobbs, Director of Blue Planet Red. Today I'd like to offer a response to the film review of Blue Planet Red that was recently published on the New Scientist website by author Simon Ings. I was very happy to see that New Scientist and Simon took the time to watch the film and to review it. It seemed like they generally had a good time with the film, but brought up some things that they felt were not correct about the science. And today, I'd just like to address some of those concerns to see if we can start a dialogue and maybe connect and continue this conversation. So we're going to start off with something a little complicated here, and that is the microbial life tests that were sent to Mars in 1976 on the Viking mission. One of the more confusing parts about the microbial life tests in 1976 is what NASA took away from those experiments. At the heart of this is one particular test known as the labeled release experiment. And this labeled release experiment aboard two different Viking landers that landed on opposite sides of the planet, it produced a positive result for life when it tested the soil for life. The problem was there was another test, another experiment called the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, and all it did was search for organic matter in the soil. And when it searched for organic matter in the soil, that test came back negative. So NASA, I guess rightfully so, questioned, well, how can you have life in the soil of Mars without any organic matter? So they ultimately determined that these life test results were inconclusive or ambiguous. The problem is, decades later, the Curiosity rover did find organic matter in the soil. And the question is, why hasn't NASA revisited those results that they originally received in 1976? Because had they detected organic matter in the soil in 1976, would they still have determined that the life test experiment results were inconclusive? Had everything tested positive back then, perhaps they would have come to a different conclusion. And I guess the question is, why is it that they couldn't find organic material in the soil in 1976? And the answer is because the test simply wasn't sensitive enough. It wasn't able to detect the organic matter that it was designed to look for. Keep in mind this is a half century ago, so technology has improved very much since then. Now, we don't spend a lot of time in the film talking about these life test experiments specifically. But if you'd like to do a deeper dive on this story, I highly recommend a book by the name of Mars, the Living Planet, written by my friend Barry DiGregorio, who is an astrobiologist and Gil Levin's biographer. Barry has outlined in exquisite detail the history behind the designing of this life test experiment and its inclusion on the Viking mission to Mars. And if you'd like to go deeper still, I have an interview with Barry on my YouTube channel, as well as an interview with Dr. Stephen Benner, who is an award-winning biochemist in Florida, who has studied the Viking life tests in great detail and concludes that there's really nothing else that could explain the positive result that the labeled release experiment got in 1976. So given all that, the question is, why hasn't NASA revisited these results? Here we are nearly a half century later, and not only have they not revisited these results, but they have not sent any additional life test experiments to Mars to either confirm or deny what they had originally detected in 1976. But we do have ways of testing the soil differently than what they did in 1976 to confirm life on Mars. And if you take a look at my interview that I did with Alpha Mars, of which Dr. Stephen Benner is included on that, they have a neat gizmo that can test for alien forms of DNA. And the question is, will NASA send it to Mars? Maybe one day. Let's hope. Going to quote from the review here. The documentary promotes the baseless idea that Mars was once inhabited by an advanced civilization. Well, I question the use of the word baseless. Carl Sagan has this very famous quote a lot of people like to use: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And to which I would respond with another quote by Carl Sagan from his Cosmos series and Cosmos book. Intelligent life on Earth first reveals itself through the geometric regularity of its constructions. And what does that mean? That means if you were visiting Earth, if you were an alien visiting Earth, and you look down, what would be the first thing that you would see coming down to Earth that would indicate intelligent life existed there? You would see large geometric structures, cities, streets, things of that nature. And what we do see on Mars are large, symmetrical structures that arguably have repeated expressions of the same geometry, which makes you wonder, how could nature produce something like this? And it's not just one or two, it's dozens of them. So we are presenting evidence in the film by way of photographs. And let's be clear, when I use the word evidence, I use it in the strictest legal sense. In a court of law, evidence does not mean the same as proof. Evidence meaning suggestive of, proof meaning conclusive of. And photographs are considered evidence. And so when we see photographs of what appear to be these large, symmetrical, geometric shapes, it makes you wonder, how would a mountain form like that, or how would a volcano form like that? Because mountains and volcanoes don't look like these things that are almost a mile in size, or sometimes even larger. So we do have this abundance of photographic evidence that suggests that there was something more going on than just geology alone. Let's talk about the face. I'm going to quote from the review: the so-called face on Mars. Let's not spend too much time here debunking what has already been debunked. And I guess I just question, why are we using this word debunked? Like, who has debunked it? Like, I will grant you that the original Viking photo of the face on Mars, yeah, it looked a little bit more like a face. And let's be clear, this structure was identified as the face by a NASA employee. So we get this term, the face on Mars, from NASA itself. But what we do in the film is not dwell too much on how much it doesn't look like a face, but we present quantitative analysis by Dr. Mark Carlotto, and he outlines repeated expressions of geometry, specifically the 3, 4, 5 right triangle, which when you start overlaying these triangles on the face, you can see the smaller 3, 4, 5 right triangles essentially outlining where, the interior of this structure is, and the larger 3, 4, 5 right triangles designating where the frame of this structure is. And so the question is, was this just simply nature that produced this or not? But regardless, this particular feature was run through Mark Carlotto's fractal analysis software. And this software was used by military to try to identify the difference, when looking at satellite images, to try to look at the difference between what might be considered a plane or a tank and a tree. So it indicated that this structure, known as the face on Mars, was just so much different than its surrounding area. It was an anomaly. So even the computer software thinks that there's something different about it. And my position is that until we actually send humans to Mars to actually start digging things up, we can't know for sure. The fact that it's not a pristine face doesn't bother me. You have to keep in mind that Mars' surface is millions or perhaps even billions of years old. And, what would our Sphinx look like after 1,000,000 years? Or even 1,000,000,000 years? At what point do the facial features start eroding away? But this structure clearly shows things a little bit more quantitative. It's not just about a face. It's about the overall structure design. And by the way, I do have a future video that I'm working on currently that will address the face in more detail. So this review contends that the microfossils that Richard Hoover found in meteorites were found on the top of the rock sample. And my question is, where did you get that from? I understand that there's a lot in the film, and so maybe, some details were missed. But I indicated that Professor Hoover cracked it open, meaning he broke the meteorite in half, let's say, or chipped off a piece and looked inside, and it is inside, deep inside, where he actually found these microfossils. So they weren't found on the surface, they were found inside. So if you'd like to hear more about Professor Hoover's process, I have a 5-hour interview on my YouTube channel where he outlines in detail his sterilization process and his methods by which he goes inside these meteorites and looks for these microfossils. So the film review continues by saying that the anomalous objects that we present, photographed by the rovers there, are just rocks and nothing more. There's lots of strange looking features on the surface of Mars, and who knows, maybe the ones that we presented in the film are just rocks. But there's dozens of them that just have really peculiar shapes, and what we find most interesting is that a lot of these odd-looking objects are just distinctly different than the surrounding area. Two of the most notable ones are the one that appears to be a perfectly smooth, cylindrical, and circular, what I would consider to be something that looks like a buried column in a hillside that is surrounded by a bunch of rugged rocks. So it just doesn't fit the rest of the landscape. And I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence that suggests some of these objects are perhaps machine artifacts or something like that is presented by Tim Saunders. And he has an engineering background, and he reverse engineered one of these objects because to his eye it just had an uncanny amount of symmetry to it. And given his analysis, it's hard to argue that it's just a rock, and we could be conclusive of that. So while we're not certain of anything, our position is until we go and take a closer look, we're not going to know for sure. There's just so many anomalies on the planet. Surely we need to send humans to Mars there, and not just geologists. We need to send biologists, archaeologists, and paleontologists. The review continues by saying that lightning bolts cannot leap from planet to planet. And I guess my question is, what is that based on? Certainly it's not something that's very well known, but if you look at electrical discharge, the phenomena is scalable. You get shocked on the door handle when you reach for it in the wintertime, lightning from the sky to the ground, different scale. And if you look at the aurora borealis, that is an interaction of our solar wind and the Earth's magnetic field. So it's a much larger in scale electromagnetic phenomenon. And would it be that impossible to imagine two planetary bodies of opposing electrical charges discharging between the two? We present this odd scar of Mars, the Valles Marineris scar, which has such a peculiar shape, which was reproduced in the laboratory by electrical discharge processes. So isn't that a bit odd that we can reproduce something in the lab that looks exactly like a canyon on Mars that is the size of the United States? It just doesn't look like water erosion. And if you look at the rest of the surface of Mars, there's all these hexagonal craters, which meteor impacts do not produce hexagonal craters. They produce circular craters. So the electrical or plasma discharge phenomenon is not very well understood, but if you want to do a deeper dive on that, I have another video on my YouTube channel with Professor Robert Schoch, who's a geologist from Boston University, who goes into great detail about this and can explain it better than I can. The question of John Brandenburg's Xenon-129 and nuclear holocaust hypothesis is brought up in this critique. You know, John Brandenburg, he's a very smart guy. He identified that Mars had an ocean in its distant past way back in 1986, and the scientific community, it didn't receive that well, but now it's come around and it accepts this idea that Mars was a blue planet just like Earth. So he's no stranger to proposing ideas that later turn out to be accepted. You know, I tried to get NASA and JPL and NATO and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and even a nuclear weapons expert from Georgia Tech to respond to these data points that Dr. Brandenburg has identified being indicative of an ancient nuclear detonation on Mars. And unfortunately, I couldn't get anybody on camera to refute this claim. And I question why. Is it because they know it's true and they don't really want to talk about it? Or they just find it to be nonsense and not worth their time? I don't know. You know, hopefully we can get some of them to answer these things on camera. So, you know, why does Dr. Brandenburg continue talking about this? Well, why not? It seems to be one of the most fascinating parts of Mars history. It seems to be one of the most incredible stories, if true. And so far, no one can prove that it's not. So I think it's worthy of closer inspection. More specifically, this review brings up how the Xenon-129 can be explained by the decay of iodine-29, which is a natural process. And I asked Dr. Brandenburg about this, and here's what he had to say. As for iodine-129, yes, it is also produced by hydrogen bombs and supernovas. Earth inherited it from the solar nebula, which was sourced from past supernovas. So did Jupiter and the Sun, Moon, and primordial meteorites, but no Xenon-129 excess versus Xenon-132 excess exists there. The iodine-129 has all decayed in these reservoirs to Xenon-129. Those reservoirs are all close to 1-to-1 in abundance in Xenon-129 excess versus Xenon-132. So why is Mars different? So yes, iodine-129 does decay, but why is the proportion of Xenon-129 to Xenon-132 so dramatically different on Mars? And it's not just about the xenon-129. There are radioactive hotspots indicating that the soil is radioactive, like Chernobyl or Nagasaki or Hiroshima were after the bombs went off there. And the signature there indicates something very specific called R process, which is the physics that happens inside of a supernova or a thermonuclear detonation. So unfortunately, to date, no one has really been able to offer a natural explanation for the abundance of xenon-129. So Simon, a new scientist, thank you very much for watching the film. I look forward to connecting with you guys if you're open to that, and perhaps we can continue this conversation. Thank you.